over to you.
Thank you, Katarina. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Jose Roberto Luna from UNFPA headquarters, and I will be moderating today this session, this amazing session about child marriage and human rights accountability. And we know that we want, that the human rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And for that, we are honored today to have, great speakers from different regions, from different countries. They are powerful, they are committed, they are advocates who are going to share, their experience with us through, group work. As we know, child marriage is a human rights violation deeply rooted in gender inequality and gender discrimination. And that means that the states have the obligation to respect, to protect, and fulfill human rights for all. And because as global program, we are also committed to embrace this human rights based approach to end child marriage. That means that we have to address the principles of equality, non-discrimination, participation, and accountability. And that's why we are here. And we would like to hear also from you, what do you know about accountability? What are the avenues or, the different elements of accountability from the cycle of accountability that we can use? I would like if Katarina can share with us, the Mentimeter, just to get a sense of, what's the process of accountability around, ending child marriage that you have seen in your context, in your country, or in the country that you are working on. So Katarina, if you can share with all the Mentimeter.
Yes, so I've also posted the link in the chat. So please just click on the link and fill it out. Alternatively, you can also grab your phone and enter the code 8353-0655. And then you can fill out the question, what level of human rights accountability has been used in the country where you work to end child marriage?
And we are getting the results. And we can see that, for example, political accountability, legal accountability, and social accountability are on the top. And we can see, thank you everyone for being participating. Social accountability, interesting how this is changing. So we can see that, there is a range of different avenues for accountability that has been implemented so far in our countries, in our context to end child marriage. And this session is really about that, how we can discuss the different avenues, the opportunities, and listen from different countries and experience about that. Thank you everyone for participating through the poll. For the global program, working with civil society organizations that also advancing the national action plans, looking for financial mechanisms, budgeted action plans, it's critical. And the participation of the right holders is critical as well as we are also looking for the participation and the accountability of the governments in terms of their obligations. So without further ado, we are going to start with the first speaker who is going to introduce us on these elements and the key elements about human rights and accountability. I'm very happy to introduce my colleague Alfonso Vargas, who is the Deputy Chief of UNFPA's Office Representation Office in Geneva. He was the Senior External Relation, the UNFPA Senior Human Rights Advisor in New York in the past. And Alfonso, you have more than 23 years working on human rights within the UN system and beyond, and you have been in many countries. And I would just summarize your career as a real advocate on the field of human rights. And we are very happy to have you. So over to you, Alfonso, for listening. What are you going to share with us in terms of human rights mechanisms and the key avenues for accountability? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I feel so old after all the very beautiful things you said about me. But well, there's nothing but we also fight in ageism in the UN system, so we should be also proud of all those years of experience and continue to learn with all together. So I will just start sharing a presentation. Please confirm if if everybody sees it. It's on the screen, no? Yeah.
Yes,
so I've been already introduced, so I will go directly into the issue, which is which we are treating today, which is the principle of human rights accountability in our work to prevent and end child marriage. The principle of accountability is a fundamental pillar of the human rights architecture. It's the principle governing the relationship between rights holders on the one hand, basically all of us, individuals entitled to rights, and duty bearers, those in a position of authority, which have obligations according to international human rights treaties and laws. So the principle of accountability would be a dynamic relationship by which rights holders are empowered to hold duty bearers to account. What does it mean holding duty bearers, those in position of authority and responsibility to account? First, that they have to be responsible. No, they have obligations in international treaties, and therefore they are obliged to take actions in order to comply with their obligations. They are also answerable to the rights holders. The rights holders can question, can demand, can hold them to account, means they can demand where they are in the compliance with their obligations. And as a result, the duty bearer is obliged to answer by correcting policy failures, by adjusting public services, ensuring that barriers to public services are addressed. And finally, duty bearers have an obligation of protection. No, they have to respect human rights, but they also have to protect human rights, which means they have to interfere with those that try to violate human rights. How? By providing redress and remedies for aggrieved individuals, for victims of human rights violations, in this case, as I say, child marriage. You were talking about different avenues of accountability, and there's a several number of them. We saw them in the pool, and maybe it's important to clarify a few concepts there to see what we understand by social accountability and others which were so high in the pool. I will start by legal accountability, which is the most classic understanding of human rights accountability dealing with human rights violations, which is traditionally the role of courts, and they're applying the law in protecting individuals whose rights are violated. There's a level of quasi-judicial, similar to political accountability, but it's also called quasi-judicial accountability, which corresponds to the role of national human rights institutions predominantly. In some countries, you will also find women's commissions, child protection commissions, anti-discrimination commissions with a similar role. But basically, they deal with two issues. They investigate individual complaints of human rights abuses, but they also assess policy progress. Are governments progressing in complying with their human rights obligations? And that's where the role also becomes political, in the sense that they assess policy progress. The most classic political mechanism of accountability are parliaments, because they have a mandate as the organ of the state in charge of overseeing government actions to check on policies and budgets. And in order to do that, they can organize different types of tools, including, for instance, public inquiries or other methods. When we talk about accountability, we should not lose track of the role played by governments themselves. No, I mean, we have government-led mechanisms for accountability because they are the first interested in tracking whether they are complying with their obligations or not as the main duty bearer. For that, they use policy-related monitoring and evaluation systems or administrative mechanisms to receive complaints and to address those complaints, like, for instance, conducting investigations of public services like health units, schools, etc. By social accountability, we understand the role of civil society demanding from government to be answerable, what we talked before about answerability, especially at the level of policies, executing budgets and delivering services. I will talk about that in more detail in a minute. And finally, I wanted to talk about international accountability, which is about the role all the national actors have, civil society, national human rights institutions, etc., in reporting to international human rights mechanisms. And by doing that, supporting the role of human rights mechanisms in issuing specific recommendations for the country to comply with. I wanted to just spend a second more talking about national mechanisms, administrative mechanisms of accountability, Why? Because in recent years, we have seen the emergence of a new mechanism, the so-called national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up of human rights recommendations. These are government-led mechanisms which establish something very basic. Who has to do what within government? By when? With what resources? And how progress will be measured and reported against through a set of indicators. The most important value of this mechanism, sorry, I just lost my screen. Do you still see the presentation?
No, we don't.
No.
If you click on PowerPoint at the bottom of your screen.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just lost it. I didn't know what I touched. Anyways, there are these mechanisms that are emerging, and it would be very interesting for you to track at your country level who they are and how we can work with them. Normally, they are intergovernmental bodies, bringing different line ministries together and coordinated whether by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Ministries of Justice. I leave this PowerPoint with you to check out the difference because I won't have time to elaborate on those right now. But it would be important for you to identify who those are because they have this major responsibility to coordinate government action with regard to the implementation and monitoring of human rights recommendations. We saw that social accountability featured quite prominently in the poll, but it would be important to see what we understand by social accountability if we are on the same page. Normally, sometimes we tend to confuse social accountability with just public awareness campaigns with civil society, generic social mobilization work. And of course, I mean, that is a form of social accountability, but it's insufficient. What we really mean by social accountability is putting civil society, ordinary citizens, in the driver's seat when we are talking about policy formulation, budget execution and monitoring, and the monitoring of the delivery of services at the unit level. For that, there's many experiences that have been tried over the last years. Probably you have heard about those participatory budgetings, which basically means civil society making decisions with municipalities, with ministries in terms of how the money should be allocated and spent. That's the most clear example of putting civil society in the driver's seat. That includes also, as we see in health committees at the bottom, deciding how services are designed and delivered and monitoring how this is done. I already spoke about international accountability, and that would be a long discussion, but we have seen in recent years is that the mechanisms such as the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council is dedicating far more attention to child early and forced marriage as a human rights issue. We have seen how from the beginning of the mechanism in 2008 to 2020, the attention has really increased over each 4-year cycle of the UPR. If in the first cycle, they only dealt with 63 recommendations, today at the third cycle, which is not concluded yet, they already dealt with 543 recommendations. The recommendations tend to focus on legal issues, but we see gradually that they are paying attention to issues beyond just criminal laws or laws raising the age of marriage to 18, but there's some interesting recommendations asking for a more comprehensive approach to laws and for the need to address the root causes of child early and forced marriage. And this will take me to the last point I wanted to raise, which is how we precisely need to understand the principle of accountability and the use of different avenues of accountability in applying a human rights-based approach. Applying a human rights-based approach means that we need to understand who has been left behind, the causes why those girls, the principally victims of child early and forced marriage, why they're left behind. So that will take us to the underlying and root causes of the problem, not just the symptom of child marriage itself, but the causes of the problem. And by knowing that, we will understand who are the duty bearers, so who has to take action about not only about the problem, but also about the causes of the problem, and what they have to do, what obligations they have. And the last question is, now we know who the duty bearers are and what they have to do, how do we hold them to account? I just wanted to bring you to conclude a very concrete example. It's a problem tree analysis, a very simple one, where we are analyzing the problem of child marriage in rural areas. As immediate causes, I have identified 3 branches of the problem. One has to do more with the role of women and girls in society as mothers and caregivers. legal issues such as, let's assume we're in a country where there's a law raising the age of marriage, but there are still many issues regarding the enforcement of those laws. And finally, the high prevalence of teenage pregnancy. When we analyze those causes,
we only have 1 minute.
Thank you. We go down to the underlying causes of the problem, which have to do with access to services, access to sexuality education, harmonization of laws and customary laws, and so forth. And finally, as root causes of the problem, we will identify issues pertaining to deficits in legal, budgetary frameworks, and the more root causes of the problems would be related to lack of political will, gender and age discrimination, negative gender norms, or patriarchal systems. In this context, it's very important to map out what the accountability entry points would be. And for this, I want to say there's not a right answer. I mean, we can check many different accountability forms, and we need to do it being context specific. We need to determine which accountability mechanisms in our country have the strength, the capacity, and are more accessible to be able to play that role effectively. So I just invite you to map out those accountability mechanisms, whether they are national human rights commissions, judicial accountability, or administrative accountability, for instance, to track here in this box how the government is inspecting issues of pregnant girls being expelled from schools, or how this impacts into girls' school dropout, and so forth. Now, the most important thing is that these different mechanisms do not exclude each other. They are mutually reinforcing, and it is important for us to map them out and to be very context specific in deciding how we are going to work with them. So I will conclude there my presentation, and I'm sure you have a fruitful discussion in your breakouts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, for your presentation. And just looking at that problem tree and the different elements or avenues for accountability as you have presented, I think it's just showing us how the process is dynamic and how is it has a lot of interlinkages with the policy advocacy or the policy dialogue that most of the country offices and the global program is doing in many countries. So let's go now to hear how this process and these concepts are really being implemented into the practice. So I will invite you to all join the different groups where we are going to have the opportunity to listen from different case studies from different levels, from the national and also the regional level, in addressing human rights accountability through different mechanisms and platforms. So we will have, we will listen from Asia Pacific, from Latin America, from different country offices like Uganda, Maldives. So please, let's go, and you are all invited to participate and interact with the presenters in your breakout room.